Welcome back to the Hardware Unboxed podcast. Another episode here where we're pretty much just for the entirety of this episode talking about FSR 3 frame generation, the various different pitfalls and benefits of this feature, and just general features as well. A bit of a discussion on DLSS and other features, and maybe the GPU should just be a bit faster instead of providing us with features like frame generation. So yeah, hopefully you guys enjoyed this discussion, a bit of a deep dive on FSR 3 and frame generation. Let's get into it. Good morning, Steve. I think it's time to talk about FSR 3. How are you going?
Good. It's the weekend. I'm relaxed and I'm ready to talk about frame generation, one of my favorite topics of all time.
Yeah, I know you're probably a bit less keen on frame generation than I am, which is, I guess it's interesting. You know, sometimes we see the feedback of like, would I have made a video different to you, or would you have made a video different to me? Like, who's the more biased of the presenters and that sort of thing. I think very much if you were making the FSR 3 video that you probably would have been a little more negative on it than I was, which is interesting because I think commenters probably thought the opposite. But yeah, you're not a huge fan.
I think the truth of the matter is I probably wouldn't have even made a video. I mean, I guess I would have been forced to. The whole thing with the Hardware Unboxed channel is I typically do things in a way and test products that I'm interested in. And if I'm uninterested in, like, there's been so many technologies that people have asked us to look at, like Radeon Chill, for example, back in the RX 580 days. And I have no interest in Radeon Chill. It's like not a feature I would ever enable. It doesn't suit the type of games I play. It's just not something I get excited about. So if I'm completely uninterested in something, it's really hard to look at it. And the Hardware Unboxed channel is a hobby channel. Like, it's not meant to be a serious business, at least not for me. I started because I'm passionate about PC hardware. I enjoy benchmarking. I enjoy seeing how things compare in terms of performance. So yeah, because I don't run it like a business, I'm not looking at things that I don't care about. And frame generation is just one of those things that at this point in time, I just do not care about. If I was in an Nvidia pitch meeting and I was representing, I had like a gamer tag on my head, and Nvidia was like, well, we're working on this new technology. We're developing this new technology where it doubles your frame rate. I'm like, okay, I'm interested. Go on. It makes it a lot smoother. So it gives you like the feeling of a high refresh rate experience, but there's no input at all. And if anything, it might hurt your input, but we have another feature that can probably help with that a little bit. And I'll be like, all right, have you got any other ideas? Like, let's move along. That one sounds pretty crap. But here we are. Yeah, gamers have been promised things that I don't think frame generation quite do. It's been pitched to them in a way that makes it seem a bit more exciting than it actually is. And I don't think it's a direction we want to take GPU hardware and PC gaming in, unless they can obviously fix the grievances I have with the technology. I'm not holding my breath for that one. Anyway, I've probably done a little bit of, I guess the point is I'm not that interested in it in its current iteration. Certainly more interested in the upscaling side of things. And even that I'm not super interested in, but that's certainly much more beneficial and has proven worthwhile in a lot more scenarios than stuff like frame generation, which I think for the most part is pretty useless. I'm
sure we'll talk about that as we go through this as well, because I'm not. Yeah. I wouldn't say I have a different opinion to you. I think my opinion is probably slightly less negative, but I don't think that frame generation is as good as upscaling. Like the amount of times that you can realistically use upscaling is pretty much all of the time. Like, obviously, if you're gaming at 1080p, it's not great, but for most gamers, upscaling is like turn it on, works pretty well. Frame generation's like, okay, here's the checklist of things that you need to check off to make sure that you're like part of that group. And if you check off all the things, then go for it. Hit the enable button. If any one of those things isn't there, then it's probably not going to be great.
I think keep ranting on, but I think if it was pitched more genuinely for what it is, and I think more people are starting to realize what it is, which is what we've said from the very start, that it's a frame smoothing technology. It smooths out frame rates. It tries to improve the image quality with smoother frame rates. Now you can argue whether it does or doesn't improve the image quality. I mean, that's a whole different thing, but that's really what it is. It's not a performance boosting. It doesn't boost your FPS, which is what it appears to be doing, which is it's quite misleading in that sense. but it really smooths it out. And yeah, under certain scenarios, in certain conditions where it's implemented really well, it can give you that sort of high refresh rate look without the full experience. Anyway, I'll stop because
well, I think you make a good point, because I think Nvidia and AMD have advertised this as a performance enhancing feature.
mm-hmm,
And I think that is very much twisting the definition of performance. Like,
mm-hmm,
what we've always come to assume that performance means isn't so much a visual side of things. Like, performance doesn't mean the quality of the frame. Like, you're never turning up from high to ultra settings and going, oh, you've improved the performance of your gaming experience.
mm-hmm.
And that's pretty much what frame generation is doing. Like, it's improving theoretically the quality, the visual quality of your gaming experience, which we've never associated with performance. Performance has always been about the latency and input of the gaming experience and the overall package, which typically is associated with both input latency and the frame rate and the visuals and the smoothness and so on. So this sort of redefinition of performance to mean just the visual smoothness of the game. I think they were hoping that gamers would have caught on with that, but I don't think it's gone perhaps as well as they have thought that it has. And it's kind of, again, like, I think in a previous podcast we were sort of talking about methods of cheating. Like,
Mm-hmm.
these companies want to have the biggest FPS numbers on their chart because it makes their product look better, but
Mm-hmm.
instead of improving the products in the way that we've traditionally associated with improving products, which is you make the GPU itself more powerful, what they're starting to do is just cheat in various different ways, like by using frame generation to pump up those FPS numbers. And yeah, again, it'll be interesting to see where that goes in the future. But I guess to start off with, I should probably just recap FSR3 for
Sure.
people that are sort of listening to this podcast and wondering what on earth we're talking about. It is definitely worth going and looking at my video on FSR3, because obviously it is a visual technology. So an audio podcast is not the best way to describe what's going on. But essentially, last Friday, AMD sort of surprise announced FSR3, the final version that was now shipping in games that gamers can now play. It was announced back in November of 2022. So it's about 11 months on since their announcement. It's now available for people to use. And similar to NVIDIA's DLSS 3 technology, this is a frame generation, frame interpolation technology. The difference between NVIDIA's tech and AMD's tech is that AMD's technology works across all GPUs. So whether you've got an AMD Radeon product going back as far as the 5000 series or even earlier, I think, or you've got an NVIDIA GeForce product, including those that don't support DLSS 3 frame generation, you can use FSR3, whereas, of course, DLSS 3 frame generation is exclusive to RTX 40 series products. So it works in a fairly similar way. You're generating one real frame, and then you're interpolating between your real frames these sort of generated frames, which are not rendered normally by the game engine. So as Steve's mentioned, they don't factor in any game input or things like that. So the goal is to double your frame rate by using these interpolated frames. So yeah, it ends up working pretty similar to DLSS 3 in terms of it's sort of how it impacts latency, how it impacts the smoothness. The general thoughts that we had on FSR 3 are pretty similar to DLSS 3 in terms of the conditions you need to be running to make sure that FSR 3 doesn't introduce visual artifacts and doesn't cause a really sluggish, low latency experience. So pretty similar there. And the frame generation, the quality of the frame generation itself, I think is reasonably similar to DLSS 3 frame generation. Of course, though, FSR 3 requires the use of FSR upscaling. With DLSS frame generation, you can use any upscaling technology, whether that's native rendering, FSR, or DLSS. With FSR 3, you are required to use AMD's FSR upscaling, which we've said in the past isn't the highest quality upscaling technology on the market right now. So that's probably one of the main downsides to its visual quality. And then AMD as well had a number of issues with sort of configurations with FSR3. So things like variable refresh rates don't work well with FSR3 and things like that. So yeah, it's a bit of an interesting launch. I don't think it's a total fail, but it's not a great showing, I don't think. Would you agree with that based on what you've seen from my video and any testing that you've done?
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. Obviously, AMD wasn't that confident in the technology either. And they sort of knew that they knew it was half baked, it had a lot of issues. but at this point they sort of just needed to get it out. So I think if they hadn't made the promises they had made and put themselves under the time crunch that they were put under, we probably wouldn't be seeing this for many more months until a lot of those issues are sorted out. So in a way, there is hope there that AMD can improve things. And I know a lot of people sort of go, oh, it'll get better. There's no guarantee of that. I'm certainly not suggesting that in 3 months, FSR is going to be wildly better than it is today. It might be that they're just technical issues that they've run into that they're trying to fix, but they just can't overcome them. Or maybe they'll overcome them in a year or two when it's possibly not as relevant. I'm not sure. But yeah, I agree with all of that. Again, it's not a technology that I care about or are excited about. So it's hard for me to get excited about it or comment on it too much other than, agree with your video.
Yeah, it was a very bizarre launch, I think. And I think a lot of what you were saying there about AMD, I don't know, kind of shooting themselves in the foot by announcing it too early and then sort of being under this crunch to get it out. Otherwise, it just gets more and more embarrassing, I guess, how long it's been since they've announced it. Like, I think Nvidia copped a lot of criticism for announcing RTX 20 series products supporting ray tracing and DLSS, and I think it took them several months to get out the first ray tracing and DLSS titles, but it wasn't 11 months. It was well before that we sort of got those games. I think maybe a couple of months after launch, we got ray tracing, and then a couple more months after that was DLSS.
Similar result, though, because both of those implementations, the ray tracing was laughably bad, awful.
Yes.
And DLSS was even worse. So, obviously DLSS has improved out of sight since then. It was still a very bad launch. So I guess that's what you're saying, that they put themselves in a position where they had to get that out. So they're like, well, and
pretty much.
And in typical Nvidia fashion, they fully put the blame on the developer. Whatever.
Yeah, it's odd. I think AMD claims that they were working on FSR 3 before the announcement of FSR 3 and DLSS 3 and things like that. I don't know whether that's actually the case. It seems like if they were announcing it way back 11 months ago and they're launching it now, that the bulk of the work has probably been done since the announcement. They're kind of stuck in a hard place because they basically had to announce FSR 3 when they announced it, because Nvidia had just come out with frame generation and they were about to launch their new RDNA 3 products. So they couldn't just launch these products without sort of mentioning what their response to DLSS 3 was, because otherwise all of those reviews that were just talking about this new added feature that you get with 40 series products is going to look quite bad, I guess, if RDNA 3 didn't have some sort of, what are they doing to respond to that? But then if the feature wasn't even close to being ready, then they are immediately put under this time crunch scenario where the longer it takes for them to get it out, the worse and worse it looks for them, to the point where they ended up launching the entire RDNA 3 series, as far as we know it, before FSR 3 was integrated into any games. So they're kind of stuck, right? Like, either they announce it when they did to mitigate the initial reviews, or they announce it later, which then people are like, well, where's AMD's FSR? Where's FSR 3? Like, what are they doing frame generation? By constantly being behind on features like they sort of have been for the past generations, they're kind of stuck in this position. There's no option there that's good for them. I think the launch as well was quite frustrating to cover, because normally when we get these sort of new features and technologies, we are given things like press briefings and so on. Like, they'll come and they'll detail all the various different nuances to the technology, how it works, what you can expect from it, what you can expect from your testing. But with just launching it out into the market, there was none of that. Which, again, like, we're not required to get early access. Like, it's up to a company to decide whether or not to give early access. We're not entitled to it or anything like that. But it does make our job harder, because we're then, for example, I go through and I find things like anti-lag plus doesn't work with FSR 3. Variable refresh rate doesn't work with FSR 3. So if there was a press briefing, these are things that we may be able to ask AMD about beforehand, so that when we test it, it's like, oh, okay, well, they said that was a problem. We found the same thing, makes sense. Yeah. But now it's like, I find all these problems. Now I have to be like, okay, well, now I need a meeting with AMD to sort out whether these are my issues, like my configuration problems, or is this known problems from AMD? So, when people are trying to rush out opinions and they're trying to do these videos, not that I was rushing my video or anything, but certainly other people got out, first impressions and things more quickly that perhaps didn't have some of these things in it. I don't know whether that's sort of helping the situation or not. Like, is it helping to have people come out and say that it works in a certain way and then it turns out that it doesn't work in a certain way? Like,
no, it definitely helps AMD. The way they launched this technology into these two games was absolutely the way to do it from their perspective. Because had they given everyone 1 or 2 weeks to fully analyze it and get their content ready by a certain embargo date and time, it would have gone way worse for them, because it would have been pretty well universally known throughout reviewers that things like variable refresh rate weren't supported, and all the flaws and issues with the technology would have been known. And then AMD's put in a position where they're like, oh no, we're definitely fixing that. We're aware of that issue. That'll be fixed. And then they'll give some sort of date or time frame that they probably absolutely cannot meet. And that just compounds the issue. So by doing it the way they've done it is the way to do it for a technology that's half-baked and they don't know what they can and can't fix. But they had to get it out the door. So they launched on a Friday, and hoping that people would do initial impressions, which is what they did. R/AMD goes wild and calls it a success. They announce it a success before anyone's actually properly analyzed it. You get a lot of people doing initial impressions, which, initial impressions, things like DLSS 3 looked pretty good to me on initial impression, because I was playing at 120 FPS base frame rate and I was testing in one of the best examples, for the technology. So like, man, this looks pretty good. I don't feel too negatively about this. And then you started digging in. You're like, hey, have you tried this from like 30 FPS to 60 and then from 60 to 120? And then I started doing that. I'm like, oh, okay. So where this would actually be the most useful for gamers, it's very bad. Like, it sucks. It gives you like this, it almost created this situation where, like, when you play at 30 FPS, you expect 30 FPS lag. But when you're getting like more the smoothness of 60 with it was really weird. It actually, in some ways, for me, made the experience worse.
Some of the initial impression stuff, like, it's not bad to have an initial impression or anything. And certainly some people discovered a lot of these issues pretty quickly. Like Daniel Owen, for example, on his YouTube channel, I think he had videos out within a day or something that had already discovered, the variable refresh rate issues and things like that.
Good.
And certainly some of the comments that I was seeing on Reddit and stuff were things like, hey, I've turned this on, I'm not really seeing any benefit. Like, it seems to be the same level of smoothness and maybe it's a bit juddery and things like that. And normally I don't look at a lot of impressions and things like that before I do my own video, because I want to go in without that being sort of tainted by other people's opinions. You want to sort of have your own opinion. But when you sort of find issues, it's kind of like, well, I've got to figure out whether other people are finding this problem or not. So yeah, I think the initial impressions, some of them were good, obviously, but yeah, it does sort of reduce the breadth of it, doesn't it?
Yeah, I certainly didn't mean to criticize anyone. Like, obviously, Daniel Owen put a ton of work, did a lot of great content. Admittedly, I didn't watch a lot of it because I don't really care about FSR 3. I sort of thought you could suffer through all of that stuff. But
oh, thanks.
My point more was guys like Daniel are fumbling around. And again, I don't mean this in a negative way. I mean, he's playing with the technology. He's like, why is this not doing what I'd expect? Why is this happening? Which is really cool. He's exploring it and finding it as he goes. But had you given Daniel Owen a week to play with the technology, he'd be like, why is this doing what it's doing, AMD? And AMD would be like, well, that doesn't actually work the way you're expected to work. And then he has all the information, and then he can, collect his thoughts, work out a video, and explain to everyone, well, this is broken. He's less confused whether he's done something wrong. Is this an actual problem? And that's why, had AMD given all of the tech media, say, a week, this stuff would all be very well worked out and very clear what does and doesn't work. And then you can, because it's hard to form an opinion on FSR 3 if you don't know if variable refresh rates work or not, if they're supported or not. So yeah, it's really hard to work that. And AMD knew that, which is exactly why they launched it the way they did. And it doesn't give you too much confidence that these are fixable issues, or that AMD even thinks or knows they can fix it, because they would have got ahead of this and gone, oh, look, here's a list of known issues that will be addressed. Like, recently I've been testing some new Intel GPUs, ran into a few problems, and they've already like, yep, we'll definitely have that fixed without question for the next driver update. We're aware of that issue. We've already solved it in the lab. driver will be rolled out on this date and it'll definitely solve that. Okay, well, gives you a bit more confidence that that's the case. And especially given their track record, whenever they've said this will be fixed or it has been fixed, it gets fixed. But AMD's, to my knowledge, they haven't done that with a lot of these issues. It's like they're aware of it or they're looking into it, but they haven't been like, yes, we know what the problem is there and we will have that addressed with the next game update or driver update or whatever it may be. So you're sort of sitting there, yeah, how capable are they of fixing this?
Yeah, I mean, they told me, I think with Anti-Lag Plus, they'd already known that that was a problem. With variable refresh rate, I think they claimed to me that they had it working. And then I was like, okay, well, give me the configuration that you were using with variable refresh rate and I'll try to replicate it on my end. And they gave me, the configuration and things. I didn't have the monitor they were using. I was hoping that they, would be using a monitor that I had, but I used a different monitor that was the same brand and couldn't really replicate what they were talking about. And, the example that they'd given, the sort of evidence wasn't super strong evidence. Like we were using slow motion footage to sort of show the differences between the two configurations. AMD was just sort of providing me like a still image and things like that, which doesn't tell you a whole lot. So it wasn't...
It's more evidence of what I'm saying, where they're like trying to keep it vague and be like, no, this isn't really a problem. Don't dig too deep into this. We'd rather you focus on the things that are working. And that's stuff they absolutely cannot avoid when they have press briefings on this stuff and you're allowed to talk to the people behind it and all that sort of stuff. All of those issues come to light pretty quickly. And when you hit them with the hard questions, they're like, that doesn't work yet.
So I think, in my opinion, that AMD should have delayed FSR 3. I think that you want the first impressions from people to be as positive as possible. So if a lot of these issues are genuinely solvable, like if AMD is saying, we've sort of like VSync off, not working, for example, there's that bizarre situation where apparently Forspoken and Immortals of Avium are using an old version of FSR 3 that isn't the latest version. Like that's a very bizarre situation.
Yeah, I don't know how that happens.
They've already acknowledged that it's fixed in a future version, but then the debut version of it in games is an older version. Don't really know what's going on there, but
and whenever it doesn't pass the common sense test, some sort of basic logic, it tends to be the case that what they're saying is not necessarily true. But I agree, they should have delayed it. But at the same time, you and I have been mocking them for how long now that it's on the box, it's a promised technology, and yet they still don't have it out. So, and then I'm sure they've had those conversations where they're like, well, this is a bit half-baked, it's not as polished as it could be. Okay, how long till it is as polished as it needs to be for launch? I'm not sure. 6 months? Probably. Okay, just get it out the door then. We can't wait another 6 months. So at some point, they've just got to pull the trigger on it. And it's sort of, it tells you a bit about how long it's going to take for it to improve, because it would be bizarre, right? I mean, it wouldn't be, in a way, it would be very AMD if in the next month they radically improve it, or in the the next 2 months. That'd be kind of like an AMD thing to do, which is like release a product at the wrong price or not working quite right, and then very shortly after they've copped all the flack for doing it half baked or making the wrong decisions, they just fix it. I definitely wouldn't rule out FSR 3 getting wildly better in a relatively short period of time, because, as I said, that's very AMD to do. But at the same time, they haven't given us a whole lot of confidence that that's going to happen either. So I'm certainly not suggesting it will.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of comments as well from people in the YouTube, Reddit, places like that saying, oh, we should be pretty positive on FSR 3 because it's a beta version, right? Like it's AMD's released this beta version with issues. And I mean, no, it isn't a beta version. Like, as much as we can sit here and say that there's issues, there's known issues that potentially will be fixed in the future, maybe if AMD fixes them, it's not been released as a beta version. It's not described anywhere as a beta. AMD is very much saying that this is FSR 3. You go up into the games, it's not listed FSR 3 beta anywhere. It's just FSR 3.
Even if it's
not a beta version.
How much does it matter if it was? You're reviewing what you're reviewing. Like, we always used to make this joke, Matt, who started the Hardware Unbox channel, I game with him a bit, and whenever we play Fortnite and there's some really dumb game-breaking like issue or bug. He's like, yeah, but it's still in early access. It was like 6 years later, it still says early access. I'm not actually sure if it still does. I don't pay attention anymore, but basically it was an early access game for many, many years. So whenever there was some stupid bug that just shouldn't be in the game, Matt always made the joke that he's like, well, it's early access. We can't be too hard on them. They've only made like how many billions of dollars from this early access thing. So whether it says early access or beta, does it really matter? It's like, this is what they've chosen to release into the wild and have us judge it based on that. Like AMD could have FSR 3 beta for the next 3 years.
If they're using this to market their graphics cards, like they're saying, well, you can get this performance boost with FSR 3 and, we're going to compare FSR 3 on versus DLSS 3 on for NVIDIA GPUs and things like that, then it's pretty much not a beta version. Like you're advertising that as a feature that people should be purchasing a graphics card for, and you would never recommend someone purchase a graphics card for a beta version of functionality. It's always final version stuff.
But
so yeah, simply it's not a beta.
No, but again, even with like Battlefield 5, if they're like, this is the beta implementation of ray tracing, you'd be like, well, definitely garbage. Hopefully, hopefully it's the same with DLSS. So yeah, I mean, it's just.
I think people would be able to use it as more of an excuse if it was labeled as a beta, because with so many issues that we've found, if it's labeled as a beta, it's more like, well, you can sort of excuse, not that I would be excusing it, but certainly other people would be excusing, oh yeah, but it's labeled as a beta, so that means there's known issues. It's not a final version. These things will be fixed. Whereas if it's labeled as it actually is, which is this is the version of FSR 3 that's in games, then a lot of those excuses don't really work as well anymore. Like known issues for a final version should not be there.
I mean, why this always really annoys me so much. Why are gamers making excuses for AMD?
I don't know.
It always just grinds my gears. It's like, I don't get it. Why are you defending AMD or Nvidia? Why are you making excuses for them? They're taking your money and you want to be critical of what you're getting in return, because you'll end up with a future where the GPU is doing almost no work and you're getting software-based frames that are garbage. And that seems to be the future that a lot of gamers are begging for. I don't get it. I don't know why AMD needs you to defend and make excuses for their technology that they sold you and promised you 11 months ago. And that was the same problem we had with Turing. So many people were angry with how critical we were of Turing and the initial implementation of DLSS and the initial implementation of ray tracing. Others were praising ray tracing for being this revolutionary new thing that was going to redefine graphics, and ray tracing was the future. And how much do we hear that sort of garbage? And you and I are like, cool, that might be the case, but we're reviewing it based on what we're getting now, what they've promised you, and what they're charging you for. What you've paid money for is what we're reviewing. Not that ray tracing is going to be amazing in the future. It's like the path tracing thing now. People getting all crazy. It's like, yeah, it kind of sucks right now. Like there's 2 GPUs that can kind of do it. And even then they have to fake it to a large degree to make it playable.
I guess it's kind of a misread of what reviewers do. Reviewers should be assessing products based on the here and now and what you're getting for your products right now. And it always becomes very difficult to assess things for the future. Like how many times have we heard companies say this will be fixed in the future, or this will be improved, or AMD fine wine, or DLSS will be fixed in the future, or something like that, which is all just future promises. We have no idea what's happening with that, when it's going to happen. Is it going to be in the lifespan of the product? Is it going to transform the product from being poor value to good value? We have no idea, which is why we always have to assess products based on what they are doing right now. What game support we're getting right now.
To add to that, though, I'm a reviewer with 20 years of experience, so I've seen what materializes as a useful feature or extra performance. I've seen that in the past. I know that if you're buying an 8GB VRAM graphics card right now that's quite powerful, like an RTX 4060 Ti, that the 16GB version of that is definitely going to age better in 3 years from now and will be a better investment. Like, because we're seeing that trend already. We're seeing games like Halo where most of the textures are missing on Ultra if you only have 8GB. So we've got some clear indications and examples now, like a dozen of them. We're pretty confident in 3 years that spending $50 more on the 16GB model, not that we recommend either, would be the way to go there. So we can make some future predictions and arguments there based on that. But we can also look at path tracing in Cyberpunk, and we can quite clearly say, yeah, guys, this isn't something that you're ever going to be doing on an RTX 4060 Ti or a 4070.
Yeah.
Like it's not going to get to the point where they refine path tracing where it just now works on a 4060 class GPU. So we can confidently say that you're not buying a 4060 Ti for path tracing.
Yeah, and I think the key distinction between the path tracing example and the VRAM example is that with the VRAM example, we have multiple different products that we can compare to.
Mm-hmm.
So we can say, well, your options are the 8 gigabyte model or the 16 gigabyte model. One of them works with high resolution textures and when VRAM needs to be used that's more than 8 gigabytes worth. And we've got the 8 gig version that doesn't do all of that. So then it becomes about, obviously the value discussion then plays into it, but at least we have two different versions where you can sort of say one's good, one isn't good.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas with things like path tracing, yeah, it's very much like if there was some other GPU that was a 4060 Ti class that had elite level path tracing, then you could sort of make the argument that, okay, well, potentially that card would be good for path tracing in the future, and the slower, crappier 4060 Ti that can't do path tracing is not going to be suitable for it in the future. But we don't really have that. So we can't predict into the future that a 4060 Ti is ever going to be suitable for path tracing because there's just no evidence that that would be the case.
Yeah, we actually know, though, that it's not powerful enough to do it. It's like,
yes,
it's like people still make this argument today. Like, when the RTX 2060 came out and people are like, but you would never buy like a 5700 XT over an RTX 2060 because it doesn't support ray tracing. And there'll be those that say, I bought an RTX 2060 and the ray tracing experience was great. It's like, okay, well, okay.
If you're happy, you're happy, right?
Don't know what to say to that. I've tried ray tracing with various different quality settings in a multitude of games with an RTX 2060. It's not a good experience. But, some people say 30 FPS is fine, so I'll leave it at that. But 5700 XT was certainly aged very well, had its issues as well with drivers and stuff. Not that we ran into those, but certainly plenty of people did. But it's aged very well, certainly better than an RTX 2060. But you don't even need to compare a GeForce and a Radeon GPU there. It was more that you're promised ray tracing support on an RTX 2060. I mean, arguably on an RTX 3050 as well. Yeah, it's not a good experience. You're not getting too many of those frames with an RTX 2060, and you're also not getting frame generation.
I guess we have to be fair when evaluating these. Like, you don't want to sit here and say FSR 3 will never improve. Like, this is a dead-end technology that is going to be complete garbage. Now, I was fairly confident with DLSS 1 that technology would not be able to improve to any significant degree. They had to sort of redo that with DLSS 2 as a completely different method. But I think with FSR 3 and these sorts of technologies, these issues that we're seeing are theoretically fixable. So it would be unfair to say, well, this will never get better in the future. This is what it is. This is garbage. Like, throw it out, start again. This isn't going to be the solution. However, we can't be at the same time thinking that all the issues are going to be fixed. That's to sort of sit in the middle ground where we're evaluating it for what it is, and then making comments like, well, if they did fix this stuff, it would be better, but that's not the reality of today. Yeah, commenters sort of saying, like, making excuses for companies. I agree. Like, what is the justification? Like, why are you sort of making those comments in defense of AMD? It's up to them to prove to you that they have fixed those problems. And when they do, we'll reevaluate it. Like, if AMD sends me an email tomorrow saying, hey, we've solved FSR 3's variable refresh rate issues, the patch is available right now, I would be straight away going in and trying to validate that and then making an updated video for you about it. But again, it's on them to sort of prove that, as opposed to just assuming that in the future it will be fixed.
I think my main, because I'm thinking we're doing all this frame generation talk, FSR 3, DLSS 3. I know I alluded to it and probably did almost spell it out at the start, but I think my main issue with these technologies is how they're presented. Obviously, we've talked about the performance thing and all that. If they were pitched as like FSR 3 frame smoothing or DLSS frame smoothing technology, I'd be much more on board with it. So I think my hang up is more the naming of the technology and what it's been presented to gamers to do. For me, it's almost like a really intelligent, I won't say AI based, but like intelligent, complex version of like doing what blurring does in games. Is that?
It's like a reverse motion blur, isn't it?
Yeah,
Like,
yeah.
it theoretically, on a high refresh rate display with really good frame interpolation, you would get a clearer experience. You'd see more like text in motion and stuff would be clearer for you. So it is
Yes.
kind of like a reverse motion blur.
Yeah, and so to be clear, when people say that I'm saying it's a blurring technology, I'm not saying that. I'm saying it essentially fills the role that blur was crudely doing, which was
Yes.
to remove that what would you call it, like laggy, sort
Like
of
judder? It's
jagged,
kinda like
jarring, juddery.
slideshow sort of
Yeah,
thing.
yeah. So blur was introduced to make it a bit more, smoother motion, but it sucks, and most people turn it off, and I certainly do. So it's almost like, yeah, I don't want to say blur, but it's like it's filling that
Yep.
requirement, if you know what I mean. And I think that's what it does. I really do think that's what it does. Is it's a blur replacement. It takes it to the next level and actually does it pretty well.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it's sort of the same argument that we had back with, again, like ray tracing for the RTX 20 series. The issue with that was that it was presented as a feature that you must have right now and that you must spend money on. And
Yeah.
the justification for not getting a performance cost per frame improvement for the RTX 20 series was you were getting features like ray tracing. Whereas if Nvidia had come out and said that ray tracing was a technology demo, a look into the future of graphics rendering, and our graphics cards are the only place that you can assess this tech demo for yourself, the only place where you get this glimpse into the future, that significantly changes the discussion around that feature, because now it's a much more realistic take on what the technology is offering to gamers, and people would be much more receptive to it. I think the criticism of ray tracing at the start would have been, it probably still would have been there, but it would have been a lot more muted, I guess, by the fact that Nvidia's just sort of saying, well, this is a tech demo. Like, we're not expecting this to run super well right now. You're not buying a graphics card for this experience. You're still buying a GPU for the overall general rasterization experience. But you can sort of take a look at that. Now, of course, they didn't do that, which is why they had all these problems. And I think to some degree they've learnt that lesson. Things like path tracing are more being described along the lines of a tech demo or look into the future than a must-have, you must buy a 4090 for path tracing sort of thing. So I think that's improved. But yeah, things like frame generation could certainly be advertised in a way that's more reflective of what it does. And I think that would, I guess that would improve the situation. But again, like the incentive for them to show higher FPS numbers on bar charts is far too great. Like the fact that this just turns up the FPS numbers, and even something like FSR3, like which doesn't work with VSync off, like it just does not show the frames correctly paced like the graph is sort of showing you. Like, yeah, you turn on FSR3, your FPS number goes from 60 FPS to 110 FPS or something. But with VSync off, you're not actually really seeing those frames. It's kind of even like a next level version of that, where they've kind of just made a technology in that scenario that literally all it does is make the FPS number larger without any benefit. So the incentive there for AMD to sort of say, well, this makes the FPS numbers larger, and NVIDIA is the same with frame generation. They're never going to escape that. Like, it's a marketing person is always going to jump all over that. And obviously the explanation that we're sort of saying in this podcast is much more along the lines of something that wouldn't really sell the feature very well. It wouldn't, it certainly wouldn't be an incentive to buy an RTX 40 series card like frame generation is at the moment. So one of the things I wanted to talk about as well with frame generation, which I think applies to FSR3 and DLSS 3, is sort of, maybe it's more relevant for FSR3, because AMD came out and when just talking to me about like the variable refresh rate issues and things by saying, well, the goal of FSR3 is to max out your monitor's refresh rate. This is how it sort of is designed to work. It works the best in that scenario. That's what we found. You're running at the max refresh of your monitor with VSync on, tends to work pretty well. But the issue with this, and why it's probably not ready for prime time if that's the goal, is that unless you start your frame rate at pretty much exactly half of your maximum refresh rate, turning on frame generation will actually increase latency. So what we've seen previously, of course, is that frame generation doesn't improve latency. Typically, you would get the same latency. Like if you had a 144 hertz monitor, you go from 60 to 120 FPS, your latency won't improve. But if you start at 100 FPS, you max out your monitor to 144 FPS with frame generation. Frame generation has to generate every second frame, which means your actual render frame rate has now been reduced. So in that 100 to 144 FPS example, theoretically, your frame rate has had to go down to something around 75 to 80 FPS, whereas previously it was rendering natively at 100 FPS. With that sort of target of let's max out your monitor, for a lot of gamers, the experience there is probably not going to be super compelling. I think that's, I guess, a problem, like a pretty serious problem with the way that frame generation works now. And if Nvidia and AMD are sort of targeting this, let's max out your monitor situation, they can't just be like reducing the native render rate for people, because it's not going to be, that's not a great experience for people to just suddenly reduce the number of real frames that you're getting. It's just not. Anyway.
Well, hear me out, Tim. Just
Yep.
hear me out on this one. I think I can speak for all gamers when I say this, that we would have been better off had the current generation GPUs actually offered an improvement, a noticeable improvement in cost per frame. Like, imagine instead of getting fake frames, interpolated frames, FSR3, DLSS3, just imagine for a moment if we got 40% more performance at the same price. So instead of a 4060 Ti costing as much or more than a 3060 Ti and being slower in a handful of games and at best about 5 to 10% faster, imagine if it cost the same amount but was 40% faster. Would that have been better than DLSS 3?
Well, yes. I mean, obviously, yes.
So
right?
This is what annoys me when you get all these guys on r/hardware and r/Nvidia and r/AMD, all of the fanatics, all of the really enthusiastic guys, and they just beat each other over the head all day about what's better, like how good frame generation is or which GPU is better, AMD, Nvidia. I don't care. Just stop it. Like, we should be all on the same page. We don't want crappy GPU releases. We don't want to go backwards in some situations, and we don't want the cost per frame to just stay the same after 3 years. We don't want to be distracted. It's like almost like political plays. Like, we don't want to be distracted by all this noise and garbage. What we want is for GPUs to become faster, and then that solves the higher refresh rate problem and all the stuff you've been talking about, because you're actually getting more performance than you would have been otherwise. And then you hear all these ridiculous excuses like, oh, they're doing the best they can. You know, they can't sell that GPU for any less. And yeah, so anyway, it's just
it's just
all
that's total BS.
yeah, if you believe that,
absolute garbage that they cannot sell those products for less.
Yeah,
it's just so not true.
So,
but yeah, I think it sort of comes back to the discussion about these companies cheating in these sort of performance charts and things like that. It's like, what's easier for a company to do? Is it improve the cost per frame, which may end up reducing margins or mean that they have to put in more work, or maybe they can't increase the margins as much as they want to? What's easier, doing that?
Keep the margins the same.
Or keep the margins really high and inflate them as much as possible, make the GPUs weaker, and instead sell you a frame generation technology. Like, I'm not saying that frame generation requires no work. Like, obviously you have to pay developers to create that feature. You have to make sure your hardware supports the feature. Now, AMD has proven that really any hardware can support a frame generation feature. So that's pretty much a solved problem. But the software side of things requires resources. But come on, like, is it? What makes them more money, right? Paying the developers to create frame generation or reducing margins?
They've got a cost per resources graph, and Nvidia is looking at it going, yes, we know what our move is here. We will sell them software-based technologies, and then we will jack up our margins on the silicon through the roof, and the good times will keep rolling. And that's clearly what's happened. Like, we've been saying this for how long now? I guess I'm just uninterested in arguing about FSR3 and DLSS 3. I want to actually see better GPUs that we can get excited about again, recommend and buy, and not just be like, well, because we were just talking about the RTX 4060 Ti. There's the 8GB version, the 16GB version is now $50 more. You would clearly spend $50 more to double your VRAM with the clamshell design, because much more future-proof. But you wouldn't recommend either $400 for 3060 Ti like performance with it's bad. It's really bad. I mean, we've been recommending RDNA 2 across the board. It's like, well, you can buy an RTX 4090, there's the 4080, 1700 XTX, and then the further you go down, it's like, well, we probably should just buy RDNA 2. So that's not good after 3 years.
I think it was a previous Q&A episode that we were talking about sort of, I think an Nvidia executive had come out and said, the future of game rendering is going to be AI technologies. Like, people are going to be using upscaling and frame generation and things like that. And it's like, okay, but it's still the base performance of the card dictates the final quality of those features. A feature like frame generation is significantly better when your base frame rate is higher. That's just, it mitigates a lot of the latency concerns. For single player game, you can get more in that high refresh rate experience sort of range. So, selling features is nice. Like, we don't want to say don't create features, don't add value to these products by increasing the feature set and things like that. We do appreciate features, and things like DLSS have proven that there are very good quality features that can be included with these products that really benefit all gamers. But the fundamental aspect of a graphics card is its general overall performance, the actual powerfulness of the shader units, ray tracing units, tensor units, those sorts of things. That is what matters the most about buying a hardware product, is the performance of the hardware. And yeah, we can't sort of lose sight of that aspect of things as we move into companies trying to sell you more on features and things like that. Like, yeah, they're trying to sell you an experience and they're trying to, upsell you on various different feature ads and things like that. But ultimately, the performance of the card matters the most, and still to this day dictates largely how good those features are going to be. A 4090 runs all those features much better than a 4060. That's just the way it is. So yeah, I think this generation and this sort of, they're trying to market you on all these features, sell you on all these features. Yeah, I guess some gamers are sort of accepting that that's sort of the reality of the situation now and is getting excited about these sorts of things. But, if we're sort of sitting here and accepting that a 4060 Ti type product can offer basically no performance uplift over its predecessor and sell you entirely on features, like, it's not going to get better in the future if that's the sort of standard that we're accepting and sort of saying, yeah, okay, sure. Yep, make the same product after 3 years, add a few features on top, and call it a day. Like, we're all fine with that. We're all happy with that. Please add, frame generation 2 next year, where instead of generating 1 frame, you're generating 2 frames, and that's the improvement that you're now getting. Like, I don't think we want that. So
I certainly don't. Yeah. But yes, that's where things seem to be headed. So a bit frustrating.
Yeah.
But
I mean, I think in the future we will get to the point where, we have got these super high refresh rate monitors. They'll be 500 hertz, 1,000 hertz, things like that. And the only realistic way to access 1,000 hertz will be through things like frame generation technologies. But when we've got GPUs that are currently in the $200 to $300 range, the mainstream market where the majority of people are buying, we're not advocating everyone go out and buy a 4090 because it is a premium product. We want the more affordable products to be super accessible and make PC gaming great for everyone. Until those products are capable of running today's latest and greatest games with all the features enabled, things like ray tracing, potentially path tracing, high resolutions, high quality settings, until that type of card is able to do all those sorts of things, then all these feature ads and things are kind of a lot less relevant. Like, until the 4060 is able to be a really compelling, high performance, high quality card for all forms of gaming, does it really matter that it can run frame generation? I mean, a lot of the times you're going to be dealing with a base frame rate of like 40 to 50 FPS in some games, which just isn't a great experience with frame generation.
Well,
so that card needs to get significantly better, and cards
that's
like
right.
that.
And I mean, you look at all of these Nvidia technologies that have been released over the years, and you look at, like, realistically, how usable is ray tracing on a 4060? So that's a $300 US GPU. How usable is ray tracing, in your opinion, on a 4060?
It's not great. It's certainly not
great.
super usable, but it could be a lot better, couldn't it? If what you were saying was like, if the 4060 was 40% more powerful, like,
yeah.
Does that open up 1080p ray tracing in a more significant way? I mean, it probably does.
Yeah. I mean, it's still only got 8 gigabytes of VRAM, which can be problematic for newer titles with ray tracing, but there's a lot that still do work. But yeah, you've got this $300 US card that's very underwhelming. Not particularly great at ray tracing, in my opinion. Not convinced you would really realistically use ray tracing in many scenarios with that class of product. Certainly can't see you enjoying ray tracing in 2 or 3 years from now with that product. DLSS is questionable again on that product because I wouldn't use upscaling at 1080p personally. I think it's pretty crap there. And then it can be used to allow you to play at 1440p. So there is that, I suppose. But again, questionable on what games you can do that, what the frame rates will be. And then frame generation. Again, on a 4060, like most of the time, if you're using frame generation to improve the ray tracing experience, you're almost certainly going to be at less than 60 FPS, which I find frame generation pretty useless for any game really at those frame rates. Yeah, while some of these technologies, they are supported, they can technically, depending on the circumstances and preferences, be used, but they're not nearly as useful as they are on RTX 4090. $1,600 GPU, yeah, all of those three features can be of great benefit, or at least beneficial. On a 4060 where you'd need them the most, not so much.
Yes. So I think the next generation needs to focus on making sure that a 4060 type product, a 5060, if you will, is giving people 40%, 50% more performance.
And minimum, yeah.
Realistically, with how much backlog of a lack of performance we've had in that sort of price class since the sort of 1060 era, maybe we need even more than 50% more performance for sort of that mainstream product. It certainly needs more VRAM as well. So, they're sort of lagging further and further behind there. And, I guess this discussion of features does sound pretty negative from that perspective, but I think our opinion of these features would be a lot more positive if a card like a 4060 or 4060 Ti or even the RX 7600, which didn't really offer any performance benefit either, like if those products were really good, like could sit here and say, yeah, the 4060 is way better than the 3060. It's a lot faster. It can do so many more things than the previous generation card. And then look at this. Well, now, because it's faster, DLSS is better because now it's not so much a 1080p card. Now it's a 1440p card, and you've just unlocked a really good quality DLSS feature there at 1440p. Now you can run more over 60 FPS, so frame generation becomes more useful. Now ray tracing is a little bit more useful. So we'd be sitting here sort of talking about frame generation being like, yeah, okay, like it's kind of cool. It's not the sort of feature that is awesome and is a must-have and you must use it. It's fairly limited in its applicability. But, whatever, doesn't really matter. The 40 series has been awesome. All these cards have provided a really big performance improvement. So it's a nice little added bonus, but, it's not really the key feature of this generation. But we're not sitting here doing that because it's just not the reality.
Yeah, you've hit the nail on the head where the products themselves stand on their own PCIe connectors, but the products themselves are good. The cost per frame is good. It's a good product, and then you've got these nice bonuses, these new features, or these things it can do in addition to being a good product in its own right. So it really just sweetens the deal. Instead, it's like, well, this product kind of sucks, but hey, we're trying to make it not appear as garbage with these flashy new technologies that we're going to tell you do all these fancy things like boost performance. It's a performance multiplier and this and that. So, not as bad as it first seems. Give it a try.
There's even a middle ground there where like they could maybe not give us like an enormous performance improvement, sort of like a must-have major performance improvement, but they could give like a smaller performance improvement and then complement that with features, which would make the reviews, be a bit more interesting to sort of figure out how much value those features do provide to the package. But we're not even getting that. Like we're not getting like a card that's 20% faster for mainstream buyers. We're getting a card that's 0 to 10% faster, which again, like it doesn't make the products exciting. I think a 4060 that was 20% faster, that had the same VRAM as a 3060, and then added things like frame generation, DLSS, blah, 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 would be, we could kind of get excited about that. Like we could kind of sit there and be like, yeah, okay, I guess.
Well, yeah, honestly, that's still a very underwhelming product. You're only saying that because you're aware of what we got. Relative to what we got, sure. But if we hadn't have got what we got, and that's what we got instead, I think we would have still been like, we wouldn't have known how bad we could have had it. That's for sure.
True.
But I think we would be sitting there going, this is pretty underwhelming. Same amount of VRAM. It's only 20% faster. And yeah, look, it's got these new features, which, you may or and the problem with the features is you got to be so careful with how much weight you put on a frame generator, because so many people don't care about frame generation. They're multiplayer gamers. Like a huge portion of the PC gaming landscape is multiplayer gamers, or certainly predominantly multiplayer gamers. I mean, I've got a dozen friends that all game on PC. None of them play almost none of them play single player at all. A couple of them dabble here and there, and it's very briefly. Like they're like, oh, I want to go back and try out Red Dead Redemption. I'll put a few hours into that and be like, yeah, it was a bit of fun, but I want to get back to some competitive gameplay. So it's not like every single you can't review PC hardware from the perspective of everyone plays Cyberpunk. Like you just can't do that. Like such a massive percentage of our audience are multiplayer gamers, and they want more frames and Counter-Strike, Apex Legends, Fortnite, Warzone. They don't want DLSS 3. Anyway, I feel like I've done a lot of ranting this podcast. Sorry.
Oh, ranting's great. I mean, it's not even just like anecdotal evidence. Like you can look at the Steam charts and have a look at what games people are playing the most, and it's almost all multiplayer titles. There's a few games up there, things like Baldur's Gate 3, which I think maybe has like a minor multiplayer component, but the majority of the games are things like you say, like Counter-Strike and those sorts of titles, which are being played, maybe you don't need a 4090 to play something like Counter-Strike, but
yeah, more so with those games, people are using RTX 4060 type hardware. They want a performance boost.
Yeah, and I think it applies really to all features. Like there are some features that we're going to be very positive on because it generally will apply to the vast majority of gamers. And I think something like upscaling falls into that category, whether you're playing single-player games, multiplayer games, you have lower end hardware or higher end hardware, you can typically get a benefit from upscaling. Now, I do believe that the higher end you go, the more you benefit from upscaling because the quality tends to be better at higher resolutions. But certainly most gamers can benefit from an upscaling technology. Whereas when you look at all the other features that people say, and I think in the last Q&A we got a question along the lines of like, how do you recommend an AMD card now when they're behind on feature A, B, C, D, E, F, so on, right? And it's like, well, how many gamers are using something like the streaming capabilities of a graphics card? How many gamers are playing the games where frame generation makes the most sense? How many gamers are using the AI rendering capabilities for all these image generation technologies now on their consumer graphics card? Like all these things matter to some degree, but it's always going to be weighted based on,
and we account for that.
Yeah, how many people use that feature?
So we're not certainly not we're not brushing off better alleged VR support or streaming capabilities. We're not brushing those things off. They're all accounted for, which is why we always say when we're comparing to similar tier, similar performing, GPUs, Radeon and GeForce GPUs, we always say that the Radeon GPU needs to be at least 15% more affordable given the current features that you get with Nvidia. Now, whether or not you require those features or use them, that's still features that exist there and will make the card more appealing if you want to sell it on or do whatever you want to do with it. But it's not like we fully dismiss them and go, no, multiplayer gamers don't care about frame generation, so DLSS 3 frame generation, throw that out the window. Ray reconstruction, barely support at this point in time, throw that out the window. A lot of people don't care about ray trace. We're not doing that. We're saying, we're giving all of those features value, and we're saying that for the Radeon GPU to compete, it needs to be 15% cheaper. So I think people like to think that we dismiss stuff like DLSS because we don't always benchmark with it, which, my recent 7900 XTX versus RTX 4080 video, I thought was a pretty good example of why native is king, and sticking to native and actually finding out what the GPU really can do or really does do as a baseline is the way to test. Because there were multiple examples where enabling FSR gave the 1700 XTX a performance advantage over the RTX 4080 relative to what we saw at the native resolution, despite the fact that in a lot of those circumstances, it was probably producing inferior image quality, which is helping AMD essentially cheat on that benchmark. So all the Nvidia fans who are stomping their feet and, getting their pitchforks out and having a go at us for not testing with DLSS, we're doing that because it's unfair in a lot of instances, we believe, on Nvidia.
Yes, and I think that's probably going to get worse. But anyway, we'll see how that goes in the future. The final thing I wanted to talk about with FSR3 was this talk about again. This is sort of like when we go back and you were saying about how companies love to, not companies, but people in the comments love to say things that sort of excuse AMD for making features that are inferior and things like that. And I think a big one, as well as it being a beta version, is this talk about how FSR3 is superior because it works across all GPUs. So this is sort of the FSR3 is more impressive than DLSS3 because it works across all GPUs. And I think I saw that comment. We've seen that comment a lot with FSR2. So the justification for FSR2 being the only technology included into some games. One of the major justifications we saw for that was this idea that FSR works across all GPUs and therefore it is the superior technology. And in my opinion, I disagree with this. I disagree with the idea that a technology is better simply because it works across more products. I think it's more complicated than that. AMD are making this product to sell their cards, Radeon GPUs. So the fact that it works on Nvidia GPUs as well is purely a tool to nullify the competitor's features, which is then going to make you think twice about buying an AMD GPU. That's the only real reason why a feature like FSR3 works on an RTX 30 series product. Coming out with a technology that kind of works on all GPUs but isn't as good as a technology that's, say, restricted to some GPUs, I don't really see that as a win. Like, it'd clearly be a win if FSR3 was better than DLSS3 and worked across all GPUs. Undoubtedly, that is the best outcome, right? Something that's universally applicable, works really well, great, thumbs up, you've done a great job there. But is it better to create a technology that works on all GPUs, but then isn't as good? Like you kind of compromise the feature to make it work across all GPUs. But in my opinion, FSR3 only needs to work well on AMD GPUs. So would it have been better if it was restricted to AMD GPUs and used their exclusive hardware features?
If that made it as good as DLSS3 or better, then I think so. I think what you're trying to say is, because you're going to be taken out of context here, I think, by a few people, you're not saying it doesn't matter. You're saying, I believe, you believe it's a huge advantage and benefit that it's universally supported, but you don't think that it's the feature that conquers all other features. Like, it doesn't take some sort of, you're not weighting it well up here. It's like universal support is here, and then everything else, like quality and if it actually works well, is down here. You're not doing that. I think you acknowledge that it's of benefit to gamers to have an open technology that works across a range of hardware, but that isn't the be-all and end-all of deciding whether or not it's better. It's a very biased weighting system. It's there's a certain website that compares hardware, and they like to have quite a lot of bias in the weighting of. I think this is in a similar vein. So people who are pro AMD for whatever bloody reason, they're like, well, here's a thing that it's better at, and that's the most important thing. That's pretty much what they're doing. So yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's kind of a hard one, I guess, because I do agree that a feature that works across all GPUs is clearly better than a feature that doesn't work across all GPUs and is restricted to some GPUs. Like, that's just obvious. Like, you could really make very little justification for the restrictions if the features were the same. But
or close, like very close to the same.
Very close. Yeah. But I think based on my personal weighting system, I would rate the support across all GPUs as very close to irrelevant if the features isn't as good quality. I think the quality far outweighs the ability to work across all GPUs, because theoretically you could, like, I'm sure, for example, that Nvidia could create a worse version of DLSS that works across all GPUs. So they could just come out and be like, yeah, here's this terrible version of DLSS that looks like absolute garbage, runs terribly, but it runs across all GPUs. So isn't that a win for us? Like, we've done what you wanted. We gave you DLSS. We made it terrible. We really cut the feature, but it works for all of you. Like, I don't think anyone would actually want that. Like, people want a feature that actually works really well as the primary sort of thing. And I think Radeon owners at this point should be wanting a feature that works really well for them on their graphics cards. So if a path to success for something like FSR3 working really well on Radeon GPUs is that it works across all GPUs, fantastic. That's an awesome bonus. It means that NVIDIA owners can use it as well, which is, I guess, good. But if that's the path, then go for it. But I guess the longer that I've sort of been testing these features, I think the more clear it is that making a highly tailored feature that is designed to work specifically on a certain type of GPU and uses specific accelerators and things, that tends to have produced the better results.
Well, we think it could just be that NVIDIA is better at it, but
it could be, but
that's what seems to be the case.
Even something like XeSS works better on Intel GPUs.
I was going to give that example, yeah.
So, they've got the two versions there, and I know they have improved XeSS to work better on non-Intel GPUs, but still the Intel version of that, at least as far as I'm aware, is the best version
it's the most
of
optimized.
That feature. Yeah. The most optimized. So I sort of think like it's nice that FSR3 works on all GPUs, but would it be better? Would it sell more Radeon products? Would this be the ultimate solution for AMD GPU owners if it was a restricted feature? If that was the easier, more viable path? So it could be the case where, let's say it would take 100 developers to make FSR3 as good as DLSS3 across all GPUs, or maybe 50 developers just to make it good for Radeon GPUs. Potentially making it good just on Radeon GPUs is the better approach there. So I don't want to sit here saying like restricting this feature just to Radeon GPUs would be the best, because obviously the gold standard would be this open feature, works across all GPUs and delivers the best quality. But so far we haven't really seen that play out across in all of AMD's attempts at FSR so far. They've gone with the open approach, and the best that you could say for the open approach is that it kind of is attempting to make DLSS not as compelling for developers to integrate. That's really been the only success of that feature. And I'm sure RTX 30 series owners will come back and say, hey, please keep AMD, please keep making frame generation work for me, because I don't have access to NVIDIA's frame generation because it only works on 40 series products. That's a fair point. But I certainly don't weight the ability to run across all GPUs particularly highly, at least in my opinion.
Well, the only thing that could shoot you down here and prove that you're wrong is something we'll never have the answer to, but I'm not even sure AMD would have the answer to it. But it'd be interesting to know how many people who own an NVIDIA GPU currently, or did, converted to a Radeon GPU because of AMD giving them some features that NVIDIA wasn't. I'm not expecting that number to be particularly high. Are they winning customers over by being the good guys?
Yeah, exactly. Like, by making this an open feature and working on all GPUs, is that translating into Radeon sales? Yeah. And I would say it's not.
No, I wouldn't have thought so, but we don't know. But just based on how we know how people generally behave and the way they go about things, I would think not. And if that's the case, then why do it? So they would need to get some actual hard data on that. Like, is this of benefit to us? Is it helping us sell more Radeon GPUs? Is it helping win over NVIDIA customers? Or is it just helping NVIDIA customers out and see them remain NVIDIA customers?
Like, I think the original goal with the open approach for this was to make a universal upscaling technology that means that developers wouldn't need to integrate DLSS into games anymore. So then that feature just becomes irrelevant. Like, people wouldn't choose to buy NVIDIA GPUs anymore because all games are just using this universal technology instead. And therefore people can choose to buy Radeon or GeForce based on the other strengths of the product, which could come down to the value, performance, and other things. I think that was the original goal of it, but I think it's fair to say at the moment that has not worked.
Well, the quality hasn't been good enough to nullify those features. So it's just been like, here's sort of our version that's not quite as good, but
I'm not sitting here saying that Radeon needs more sales. Like, I ultimately don't actually care whether Radeon or GeForce gets more sales. And I think as well, obviously the ultimate solution, as I've said, would be something that works. It's just one feature, works across all GPUs, delivers excellent elite image quality, and is the best feature. That's obviously, I guess, the best solution for gamers in general as a whole would be that. But we have to sort of be realistic about how achievable that is. and how likely we are to get that sort of feature now or in the future. And potentially a better solution for gamers would be this sort of Nvidia has a really good feature for their owners. Radeon has AMD has a really good feature for Radeon owners, and that's currently the best option that we've got because they've just gone down their proprietary path and they've optimized it for that hardware. Maybe that's the way that is the best for gamers in the end. So it's a tough one because we don't want to sort of dismiss running across all GPUs as being irrelevant and unimportant because it is important. It's just that I don't weight it super high. I think there are other aspects that they kind of have to nail the quality right and then offer it across all GPUs for that to be of benefit to people considering buying a Radeon GPU. And certainly in the current state of FSR3 and DLSS3, if you were choosing to buy a new GPU right now, you wouldn't be sitting here going, okay, well, we've got DLSS3 for NVIDIA owners, but then FSR3 is really pulling me across to a Radeon product. Like it's just not really doing that at all. Again, like it's not where it needs to be for that to be of significant benefit, I guess.
Yeah, I think, well, my assumption is that the majority of people who research these products to find out which one they should buy at a given price point are probably looking mostly at the performance, like the baseline performance of what they get, which is what we deliver, and it seems to be what the majority of our audience are interested and care about. And NVIDIA would love dearly for us to provide, frame generated numbers to those graphs to show them blowing, or they would have been previously blowing away the competition. But I think that would be doing a disservice to our audience. But I think most people aren't looking so much heavily at those features. Some people will be, but I think most people just want to know, I want the most performance I can get for my money. So which one offers that?
As time goes on, people are weighting a bit more heavily, not super heavily, but they're including features like DLSS more in their buying decisions. But I think that's generally more when you've got two products that are fairly closely matched in performance.
Mm-hmm.
So that at the moment tends to be most products, right? Like you're looking, the pricing to performance ratio is pretty similar between AMD and Nvidia right now. So
well,
I guess people are deciding on features like that.
When the Radeon RX 7800 XT launched, and it was $100 cheaper than the RTX 4070.
Yes,
that's right, isn't it? Yeah.
Yep.
Clearly that was enough. And NVIDIA agreed that was enough to convince people to buy that instead, largely, which is why they reduced prices to counteract that, and why you saw $50 dropped off the RTX 4070. So if there is a big enough pricing discrepancy there, DLSS and frame generation and all that stuff is not enough of a draw card in the mid-range to low end for people to just, without question, buy the GeForce GPU. And I mean, that seems pretty evident based on how that comparison played out.
Well, I think that's probably a fairly long discussion about frame generation and features and things like that. And I'm sure
I made it.
Yeah. You made it. Yes, we probably ruffled a few feathers with some of our ranting about these sorts of things. So it'll be interesting to see your comments in the discussion below and things like that. Can't wait for that. Let's take a break. We'll come back and we'll talk about, again, our super boring existences outside of testing these features. All right, Steve, we're back. What has been happening in your life so far this past? It's a little bit more than a week. We've taken a little bit longer time to get this podcast out. So what have you been up to? Anything exciting?
Mostly family and friend related stuff. We had a couple of big do's at our place, so quite a lot of people, and that was a lot of fun. So I've been busy with that. We've got a lot of like projects on the go, so I've been planning for those, ordering stuff, and been sort of busy with that sort of home life, family stuff. So that's been good. Obviously been doing a lot of work as well, though. Not a lot of big benchmarks at the moment. Yeah, because I have been busy with other things, but we have some stuff coming up, so that's good.
Did you watch the grand final, the AFL grand final last week on Saturday?
I did watch that. That was the day after we had all the family here and friends. And that was a very good game. Yeah, it was amazing. I'm glad I'm glad I didn't care which team was going to win, and I'm glad my team wasn't involved because that would have been a very stressful day.
Yes. Your team being in the grand final, very stressful. I remember that a few years ago. Obviously, my team's been crap since then, but Yeah, that was a stressful day. Yeah, I thought it was a good match. I enjoyed it. It was
Mm.
closer than usual. Again, people from overseas probably wondering what the hell we are talking about. Of course, this is Aussie rules football. They had their final match on the weekend. And yeah, it was a very close, good quality game. And yeah, neither of our teams were in it. So there were very low stakes. I had a couple of my family members over, had a bit of a enjoyable time watching it. And yeah, just having some snacks and things like that, which was good. So yeah, unfortunately, I was a little bit sick during those couple of days. I managed to get myself a cold or something like that, which I'm sort of still.
Tim was sick.
I was sick. So my voice was a little bit weird in the FSR 3 video and things like that, but I'm pretty much back to normal now. Another thing that happened to me this week was actually last night. I tried to buy a monitor from Samsung because Samsung at the moment isn't providing us with all of the latest and greatest monitors. They have done it with some of the monitors, but they're not super on the ball with, a new flagship product comes out, I request it, and they're kind of like, yeah, we'll see, things like that. So I thought, oh, okay, I'll pull the pin, I'll try buy this product for them. I think they had like a discount or sale going on. So I'm like, okay, I can save a little bit of money here buying this product. I was interested in buying I think it was the 49-inch, I think it's the OLED G9 or something like that. Can't remember the exact product name. It's the big 49-inch ultra wide QD OLED monitor. I thought, easy done. I'll purchase that. I'll get like my $600 or $700 off. Done. Go through the ordering process, and I'm like, oh, interesting. It won't let me proceed in the cart with this. What's going on there? Turns out they won't ship it to me. So no option. Doesn't matter how much I would offer them in terms of money to ship it to me. No option. Will not ship it to my address. Will not ship it to my area, which is pretty bizarre when we're talking about a high-end, flagship, expensive, multiple $1,000 monitor. No, won't do it. So
they probably blacklisted your postcode.
Just the whole. I've done so many negative reviews of their products, have I, that they've just like nuked the whole postcode for everyone.
Yeah, it's done.
Yeah, so, no good. I guess it's possible,
but yes, that's a bit silly.
Bit silly, bit frustrating. I also tried to buy. I tried to buy the 59-inch version at the same time, like a 2-for-1 deal, and then they weren't going to ship the two. They were going to like ship the two products much later in the year together, whereas if I ordered them separately, I would have gotten one much earlier, which didn't make a lot of sense. So yeah, I think Samsung has a bit of work there to put into to making sure I can actually buy products. I think the basics of a customer experience is like you buy it and they ship it to you. So I don't even know why they wouldn't do it, because I haven't had that problem with anything else I've ever tried to buy. So I don't live that remotely. Like,
no, you should contact them and ask them why that is.
So yeah, I think that's pretty much it for this week's podcast. Bit of a longer one than last week, I think, but I enjoy the discussion on features and things like that. And I think next week, yeah, we'll probably talk about things like I'm just about to get into testing the driver-based version of FSR3 that they've put into the Radeon software, so the non-game integrated version. I'm sure I'll have a few thoughts on that by the podcast next week. So yeah, stay tuned for the video on that, because I'm just about to really dive into looking at that. And yeah, we'll see if some of the issues that were present with FSR3 are also present with this driver version.
Awesome. I look very excited to that. Can't wait.
You love frame generation, so you'll be just
love it,
diving straight into that video as soon as it comes out.
I'm going to watch it 4 times.
Oh, well, that'll be good. So yeah, that's pretty much it for this week's podcast. Thanks to everyone that's listened to this one to the end. And if you do want to provide feedback, then comments below. We've got our Discord community as well. We've got a podcast section there. You can let us know your thoughts on the things that we've said. So yeah, guess that's it. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. Subscribe, get in your podcast apps, and we'll catch you in the next one.